Today we have some more actual history from the early days of Massachusetts and the Plymouth colony. We will be reading about some events that occurred in the 1600s that led to the religious freedom that we enjoy today. These events were some of the main reasons why the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. We will be reading about the brutal oppression of Quakers by the Puritan leaders of Massachusetts that began in 1656. We will be reading from this book, The Quaker Invasion of Massachusetts, by Richard P. Hallowell. This book was published all the way back in 1883. First in this story, we will hear about the rise of Puritanism in England and New England, and then about the rise of the Friends, or Quakers, as they were derisively called by the Puritans. We will then hear about what happened when two Quaker girls, Anne Austen and Mary Fisher, arrived on the shores of Boston in July of 1656. They were not treated very kindly, and many other Quakers would experience similar religious persecution for the next several years. Puritanism, as the word implies, originated in an effort to purify the Protestant Christian Church. It inaugurated a reform almost as radical as the Protestant Reformation. At a later day, the name was narrowed in its significance, and was applied only to those who adhered to Calvinistic doctrines of religion, and attempted to establish both in Old and New England a theocracy based upon the Mosaic Law and other teachings of the Old Testament. It was the parent, however, from whose loins issued the brood of religious sects, which, as we shall see, divided the English people into hostile camps, and ultimately bequeathed to us the religious liberty we now enjoy. Under Queen Elizabeth, and notwithstanding her oppressive measures, Puritanism secured a permanent foothold in the English nation, and before the death of James I, it had become a mighty power. The introduction of the Bible into every cottage in the land inaugurated a revolution, of which the end is not yet. All other literature was subordinated to the Old and New Testaments. During the greater part of the 17th century, the people abandoned themselves to the consideration of questions appertaining to civil and religious liberty, and to the solution of religious problems. With remarkable unanimity, the early Quakers held many views of religious obligation that brought them into direct conflict with the civil authorities and social usages. These views were known as testimonies, and later, when an organization was affected, they were incorporated into what is known as the discipline of society. Church ordinances, baptism, communion table, prayer book were contemned. Silent meditation, interrupted only by a short prayer or exhortation by one or more of them who perchance were moved by the Spirit, constituted their only form of worship. They substituted simple affirmation for the oath, defending the innovation with apt and telling quotations from the Scripture. They held meetings for worship, and were generally careful to abstain from all unnecessary secular employment on the first day of the week. But they did not regard it as especially the Lord's Day. They claimed that all days are alike holy in the sight of God. They regarded the use of the plural number in addressing one person as a species of flattery, and adopted the simple thee and thou of the Bible. Your holiness, your grace, your honor, etc. were flattering titles, and therefore they addressed all men by their Christian names only. They declared that it was not lawful for Christians to kneel or prostrate themselves to any man, or to bow the body, or uncover the head to men. That it is not lawful for a Christian to use superfluities in apparel, as are of no use, save for ornament and vanity. That it is not lawful to use games, sports, plays, nor among other things comedies among Christians, under notion of recreations, which do not agree with Christian silence, gravity, and sobriety. They considered war an evil as opposite and contrary to the spirit and doctrine of Christ, as light to darkness, and they would not fight. They laid particular emphasis upon the sacredness of the married relation. They repudiated the claims of the clergy, and believed that God alone can join men and women in the solemn covenants. It is their custom, says Sewell, first having the consent of the parents or guardians, and after due inquiry, all things appearing clear, they in a public meeting solemnly take each other in marriage, with a promise of love and fidelity, and not to leave one another before death separates them. Of this, a certificate is drawn mentioning the names and distinctions of the persons thus joined, which being first signed by themselves, those then that are present sign as witnesses. This custom is still in force, and with some unimportant verbal amendments, The phraseology of early friends is still preserved. After an appropriate silence, the groom and bride rise, and taking each other by the hands, each in turn repeats, "In the presence of the Lord and this assembly, I take thee to be my wife or husband, promising with divine assistance to be unto thee a loving and faithful husband or wife, until death shall separate us." For religious solemnity and tender touching simplicity, the Quaker marriage ceremony has always challenged comparison, and if anyone desires to feel and realize the presence of God in a public or private gathering, let him attend a Quaker wedding. One of the most popular slanders current is the charge that the early Quakers held all civil authority in contempt, and were willful lawbreakers. So far from this, they were an eminently law-abiding people, and had profound respect for the office of the civil magistrates. For the insignia of office they had perhaps too little regard, but for the law on which social order and well-being depend, they showed a most exemplary fidelity. Having noted some of the more salient features of Quakerism, we are quite prepared to believe that in an age of intense religious excitement, some of its more ardent professors were victims of religious zeal, and occasionally were guilty of acts inconsistent with proper decorum. It must be added, too, that when pushed in arguments, prominent friends, including Fox and Penn, justified some of these acts by throwing responsibility for them upon the Spirit of the Lord. On the other hand, they disowned James Naylor and others on account of their fantastic extravagances. The number of Quakers was counted by tens of thousands, and at one period 4,200 of them were in the jails, not for any crime or misdemeanor, but because of their stout defense of religious liberty and their heroic resistance to religious tyranny. When driven or dragged from their meeting houses, they assembled in the streets. And when the meeting houses were torn down, they met on the ruins, from whence they were driven only by personal violence. Many of them died in prison, and many more suffered long imprisonment only to resume their life of sacrifice and trial when released. They were courageous, aggressive, bold, and unsparing in their denunciation of sin and sinners, but equally tender-hearted, loving, and affectionate. Even women suffering the tortures of the lash could kneel and ask God to forgive the wretched men who dealt the blows. The name Quaker was applied to them in derision, but as indicative of their character and aim, they called themselves Friends. When they organized, it was not in order to proclaim a creed or to build up a sect, but for humane purposes, and in Fox's phraseology, for the promotion of purity and virtue. The only test of membership was a habitual attendance at religious ceremonies. If a stranger appeared in their business meetings and wished to participate therein, he was asked for a certificate from friends of his own town, endorsing not his soundness in doctrine, but his personal character. This precaution, says Fox, was to prevent any bad spirit that may scandalize honest men from bringing reproach upon them. Questions of policy were not settled by a count of noses or a show of hands, but after grave deliberation and conference, by what appeared to be the weight or solid judgment of the assembly. Quakerism in its social and moral aspect was the synonym for brotherly love, purity, simplicity, integrity, and benevolence. The early Quakers not only advocated an enlightened vision of criminal laws and a reform in the treatment of prisoners, which was then barbarous, but they visited the prisons and sought out and aided the poor, the friendless, and the outcasts of society. They literally loved both friend and foe. Hated, reviled, and persecuted of men, they asked a divine blessing for their bitterest enemies. It is believed that numbers of the people of the town of Salem in Massachusetts, together with others of the Plymouth colony, had embraced the tenets of Quakers prior to the arrival of some missionaries in 1656, but there is apparently no evidence to indicate that they had proclaimed themselves or adopted the name of the despised sect. Had they done so, they probably would have been at least named in the recommendation of the court, made in May of the same year, that the 11th day of June next be kept as a public day of humiliation to seek the face of God in behalf of our native country, in reference to the abounding of errors, especially those of the ranters and Quakers, etc. This is the first reference to the Friends found in the printed official records. When it was made, Plymouth colony had been settled 35 years, and the Massachusetts Bay colony a quarter of a century. Roger Williams, who, with all his shortcomings, is fairly ranked with the Apostles of Liberty, had been driven into exile. Mrs. Anne Hutchinson had been suppressed and banished. Sir Henry Vane had returned to England, discouraged and disheartened. Coddington, one of the founders and afterwards a Quaker, had taken refuge in Rhode Island, where he enjoyed the liberty of conscience denied him here. Winthrop had died lamenting the part he had played in persecuting heresy. Sir Richard Saltonstall, another founder, had addressed his famous letter from England to his old friends, in which he deplored their tyranny and persecution, and besought them not to practice these courses in a wilderness which he went so far to prevent. His advice, it is needless to say, was unheeded. John Endicott was governor, and John Norton the leading minister of the Massachusetts colony, when the first two Quaker visitors arrived, and the policy of repression found in them the sternest of supporters. Anne Austen and Mary Fisher came here in a vessel in July of 1656. The laws referring to Quakers had not yet been enacted, and there was no law, human or divine, to prohibit their coming here or bringing their books with them. On the contrary, the body of the liberties enacted in 1641 was a guarantee of ample protection by the authorities if they were disturbed or molested. The prefatory declaration reads, "We do therefore this day religiously and unanimously decree and confirm these following rights, liberties, and privileges concerning our churches and civil states, to be respectively, impartially, and inviolably enjoyed and observed throughout our jurisdiction forever." The first and second declarations are as follows. 1. No man's life shall be taken away. No man's honor or good name shall be stained. No man's person shall be arrested, restrained, banished, dismembered, nor anyways punished. No man shall be deprived of his wife or children. No man's good or estate shall be taken away from him, nor in any way damaged under color of law or countenance of authority, unless it be by virtue or equity of some express law of the contrary, warranting the same, established by a general court and sufficiently published, or in the case of the defect of a law in any particular case, by the word of God, and in capital cases or in cases concerning dismemberment or banishment, according to that word to be judged by the general court. Second, every person within this jurisdiction, whether inhabitant or foreigner, shall enjoy the same justice and law that is general for the plantation, which we constitute and execute towards one another, without partiality or delay. In the face of this statute, Endicott being out of town, the deputy governor Richard Bellingham sent the officers aboard the ship, who searched the baggage of these two passengers, and seized their books, which by order of the authorities were burned by the common executioner. The women were committed to prison, where they were confined for 5 weeks. They were then sent back to Barbados, the master of the ship being bound in £100 to take them there, and he was ordered not to suffer any to speak with them after they were put on board. It seems that while in jail they used their own beds, which were brought out of the ship. These and their Bibles the jailer confiscated to satisfy his fees. During their imprisonment no one was allowed to visit or speak with them, and a board was nailed up before the window so that none might see them. They were so ill-fed, or so starved rather, that Nicholas Upsall, a church member and freeman since 1631, bribed the jailer with 5 shillings a week for the privilege of sending them provisions. Prior to this humane deed, he or some other person whose heart had been touched by their sufferings, it was probably Upsall, had in vain offered to pay the £5 penalty, if permitted to visit the prisoners. As is usual with official despots, Bellingham made some show of legal procedure when the severe treatment was ordered. The council was convened and a declaration issued, wherein it was said that there are several laws long since made and published in this jurisdiction, bearing testimony against heretics and erroneous persons, and that Anne Austen and Mary Fisher, upon examination, are found not only to be transgressors of the former laws, but to hold very dangerous, heretical, and blasphemous opinions. And they do also acknowledge that they came here purposely to propagate their said errors and heresies, bringing with them and spreading here sundry books, wherein are contained most corrupt, heretical, and blasphemous doctrines, contrary to the truth of the gospel here professed amongst us. The council, therefore, tendering the preservation of the peace and truth enjoyed and professed among the churches of Christ in this country, do hereby order, etc. What very dangerous, heretical, and blasphemous opinions the prisoners held, we are left to surmise. Quaker authorities, however, furnish us a clue. They relate that one of the women said "thee" to Bellingham, whereupon he said he needed no more. Now he knew they were Quakers. That little magic word was sufficient for the chief inquisitor. We are assured by one who should be excellent authority that the people of Massachusetts were well informed as to the spirit and actions of the Quakers, and were on the watch for them. At last they had arrived. These two women, it was clear, were Quakers, and therefore they were heretics and blasphemers. One of the dreadful women had said "thee" to the deputy governor, and her arrest prior to this, her declaration of war, was thus amply justified. The enemy had been surprised as well as by sea as by land. The invaders had been captured, and for a time at least the colony was safe. But could punishment too severe be meted out to such dangerous captives? John Endicott thought not. So he wrote a letter from Salem saying that had he been at home, he would have had them well whipped. An ordeal far more terrible than scourging awaited them. By official order, these two defenseless women were literally stripped of their clothing, and their bodies were examined for witch marks in a manner too indecent to be named. If anyone cares to know all that this implies, let him consult Winthrop's Journal, Volume 2, page 397, where he will find a narrative in detail of similar infliction upon the body of Margaret Jones in the year 1648. The recital is too disgusting and sickening to be repeated. The treatment of that poor woman was inexcusable, but it was just and honorable as compared with the treatment of Anne Austen and Mary Fisher. Before Margaret Jones was arrested, she had aroused the superstitious fears of the community. She had a malignant touch, as many persons, men, women, and children, when she stroked, were taken with deafness or sickness. She practicing physic, her medicines were harmless as anise-seed, liquors, etc., yet they had extraordinary violent effects. Some things which she foretold came to pass accordingly. During her trial, these alarming facts were duly proved to the jury, and she was found guilty of witchcraft and hanged for it. Governor Winthrop further narrates that the same day and hour she was executed, there was a very great tempest at Connecticut, which blew down many trees, etc. Though nothing can palliate the revolting torture to which she was subjected, nor justify the final punishments, it may be urged that in view of her practices, a superstitious people might be pardoned for putting her under restraint. Her predictions, her stroking, and her potions had terrified the neighbors, and judging from the record, she was arrested and tried, in obedience to public sentiment. No such plea can be entered in the case of Anne Austen and Mary Fisher. They practiced no mysteries. They never had so much as a chance to speak to a man, woman, or child of Boston. They were not transgressors of any law. There is nothing in the whole history of their case to relieve the blackness of the diabolical crime of which they were the victims. And yet, a vice president of the Massachusetts Historical Society tells us that the advent of the Quakers here began in comedy. On the contrary, the advent of the Quakers upon the soil of Massachusetts was marked by ghastly, grim tragedy, far more terrible than the subsequent hanging of other Quakers, for it involved a living death more to be dreaded than the gallows. A few days after the enforced departure of Anne Austen and Mary Fisher, another vessel anchored in the harbor with 9 Quakers aboard. They were immediately arrested, and were imprisoned for about 11 weeks. They were then sent away in the ship that brought them, the master of the ship having been compelled by an arbitrary imprisonment to give security to take them to England at his own charge. The women were spared the shocking witchcraft ordeal, and apparently starvation was not attempted, but otherwise these friends were subjected to the same severe treatment as their predecessors. During their confinement, Governor Endicott bullied them with threats of hanging. "Take heed," he said to them, "ye break not our ecclesiastical laws, for then ye are sure to stretch by a halter." It was charged that they were guilty of turbulent and contemptuous behavior to authority. But Bishop, a contemporary, whose integrity is not questioned by anyone, pronounces this a calumny forged out of your own and the brains of your priests. That it was a false charge is probable, for in the same declaration referring to Anne Austen, Mary Fisher, and these men and women, the authorities mendaciously assert that their persons were only secured to be sent away the first opportunity, without censure or punishment. Without censure or punishment, the father of lies might well be staggered by such a shameless falsehood. Early Friends, as has been shown, had profound respect for authority leavened with justice, but when officials degraded it and themselves by acts of cruel tyranny, they were prompt to resist and to rebuke. In the present case, it is quite possible that some of the prisoners spoke their minds freely to their oppressors when opportunity offered. One of them, Mary Prince, it is alleged, saluted Endicott as he passed the jail on his way to the church, with such epithets as vile oppressor and tyrant, and foretold that the Lord would smite him. It is also said that when the ministers interviewed her, she reproached them as hirelings, Baal's priests, etc. Grant the correctness of these reports. Who does not honor the brave woman, the victim of Endicott's tyranny, for defying him with a simple truth? Who can censure her for refusing with contempt and righteous indignation the proffered offices of sanctimonious ministers, who satirized the words of Jesus? I was in prison, and ye came unto me, by visiting her to convict her of heresy and blasphemy, and with such insufferable imperiousness to urge upon her the infallibility of her own superstitious dogmas. The next act in this tragedy of errors was performed while these 9 Quakers were still in jail, but before any others had arrived, and before any of the residents had avowed the Quaker name and faith. On the 14th day of October, 1656, the General Court enacted the first of a series of disgraceful laws aimed exclusively at the Quakers. It begins, "Whereas there is a cursed sect of heretics lately risen up in the world, which are commonly called Quakers, who take upon them to be immediately sent of God, and infallibly assisted by the Spirit to speak and write blasphemous opinions, despising government and the order of God in church and commonwealth, speaking evil of dignities, reproaching and reviling magistrates and ministers, seeking to turn the people from the faith and gain proselytes to their pernicious ways. This court, taking into serious consideration the premises, and to prevent the like mischief as by their own means is wrought in our native land, doth hereby order that the blasphemous heretics shall be forthwith committed to the house of correction, and at their entrance to be severely whipped, and by the master thereof be kept constantly to work, and none suffered to converse or speak with them during the time of their imprisonment, which shall be no longer than necessity requireth. Quaker books or writings concerning their devilish opinions are next interdicted, and persons who defend said books or opinions are fined, for the first offense 40 shillings, for the second offense 4 pounds, and for the third offense they are first imprisoned and then banished. Lastly, it is ordered that what person or persons soever shall revile the office or person of magistrates or ministers, as is usual with the Quakers, such person or persons shall be severely whipped, or pay the sum of 5 pounds. This formal declaration of war against the Quakers was proclaimed in the streets of Boston by beat of drum. Nicholas Upsall, of whom mention has already been made, was proprietor of the Red Lion Inn, and hearing the act read before his own door, said that he did look at it as a sad forerunner of some heavy judgment to fall on the country. The authorities, hearing of this, quickly availed themselves of the opportunity to make perfectly clear what was meant by such terms as reproaching honored magistrates. They summoned Upsall before the court the next morning, where he, in much tenderness and love, warned them to take heed, lest he should be found fighters against God. He was fined 20 pounds, Endicott saying, "I will not bate him 1 groat." He was then banished, with orders to depart in 30 days, 4 of which he spent in jail, and before leaving he was fined 3 pounds more for not going to church. On the 14th of October, 1657, a second law was enacted, the vituperation and reviling, as usual with Puritan authorities, being a prominent feature of the text. It provided for the forfeiture of 100 pounds by anyone who knowingly brought a Quaker into the jurisdiction, and imposed a fine of 40 shillings for every hour's entertainment of a Quaker by any resident. It further ordered that any Quaker man presuming to come into the jurisdiction after having once suffered what the law requireth, shall for the first offense have one of his ears cut off, and for the second offense shall have his other ear cut off. And every woman Quaker that hath suffered the law here, that shall presume to come into this jurisdiction, shall be severely whipped, and so also for her coming again, she shall be like used as aforesaid. And for every Quaker he or she that shall a third time herein again offend, They shall have their tongues bored through with a hot iron. And it is further ordered that all and every Quaker arising from amongst ourselves shall be dealt with and suffer the like punishment as the law provides against foreign Quakers. On the 19th of May, 1658, for a third time the General Court issued its decree against the Friends, forbidding under severe penalties the holding of meetings or attendance at meetings. This law also is well flavored with the usual reveling and calumny. On the 19th of October, 1658, the court enacted the fourth law, in which they incorporated Endacott's threat. Take heed ye break not our ecclesiastical laws, for then ye are sure to stretch by the halter. The preamble not only recites the old list of calumnies, but lengthens it with fresh slanders. It is followed by an order banishing both visiting and resident Quakers, upon pain of death if they return. Very properly this order is amply padded with Puritan railing and abuse. On May 11, 1659, by a special order, the county treasurers were authorized to sell Daniel and provided Southwick, son and daughter to Lawrence Southwick, to any of the English nation at Virginia or Barbados, to satisfy the fines imposed upon them, for siding with the Quakers and absenting themselves from the public ordinances. Edmund Batter, the treasurer of Salem, undertook to carry out this order. He was a foul-mouthed villain, who reveled in assaults upon defenseless men and women, and who was never so happy as when engaged in hunting down the Quakers. Pages might be filled with the recital of his infamous deeds, as they are recounted by Bishop, but he shall speak for himself, as his own recorded confession sufficiently indicates his character. It may prove an instructive study to those modern writers who note every expression of righteous indignation uttered by the Quakers, and roll it as a sweet morsel under the tongue, meanwhile remembering to forget the invective and railing of the Puritans. In the unpublished county records at Salem, there is the following entry under date 26th of the 4th month of 1660. Mr. Edmund Batter being presented to this court for saying that Elizabeth Kitchen had been a powwowing and calling her base, quaking slut, with divers other opprobrious and taunting speeches, the presentiment being not fully proved, he confessed that he said to the said Elizabeth, either have you been, or she had been a powwowing, and did say to her she was a quaking slut, meeting of her betimes in the morning coming, as he supposed, from a Quaker meeting, seeing also some other persons that were affected, and is by the court admonished, and to pay a fee of 30 shillings. Innocent women were stripped to the waist, and thus exposed to public gaze. They were beaten with stripes until blood ran down their bare backs and bosoms. The ears of men were cut off, and the bodies of men were beaten to a jelly, for attending Quaker meetings, and for testifying against your bloody and cruel laws. But cowardly bullies and blackguards such as Edmund Batter, when they insulted Quaker women, were only admonished and obliged to pay the court fees, nor did their indecency prevent their being honored church members and trusted officials in the Puritan Commonwealth, which we are taught to believe was, par excellence, the stronghold of piety and morality. This Edmund Batter hunted in vain for a shipmaster mean enough to sail freighted with human victims for a Virginia market. One captain being approached to try, Batter said that they would spoil all the vessel's company, whereupon he replied, with a testimony to the inoffensive character of the Quakers, rarely extorted from Puritan lips. He said to the ship captain, "Oh, you need not fear that, for they are poor, harmless creatures, and will not hurt anybody." "Will they not so?" said the shipmaster, "and will ye offer to make slaves of so harmless creatures?" Whittier has immortalized this scene by rendering the captain's answer in the following lines: "Pile my ship with bars of silver, pack with coins of Spanish gold, from keel piece up to deck plank, the roomage of her hold. By the living God who made me, I would sooner in your bay sink ship and crew and cargo than bear this child away." On the 22nd of May, 1661, finding the hanging business had been somewhat overdone, the court, with the customary calumny and vindictive epithets, enacted a new statute, wherein it is ordered that Quakers, both men and women, are to be stripped naked from the middle upwards, and tied to a cart's tail, and whipped through the town, also to be branded with the letter R on their left shoulder. And the constables of the several towns are empowered to impress cart, oxen, and other assistants for the execution of this order. the author of the New England Tragedies in prose, probably wrote his narrative under the full conviction that his treatment of the Quakers is very magnanimous, and his criticism of the Puritans sufficiently severe. But, in common with several other apologists, he manifests an ignorance concerning the real mission and character of the Quakers, combined with an acquired or hereditary bias in favor of the Puritans, by which he is emphatically disqualified for rendering impartial judgments. In alluding to the passage and the enforcement of the inhuman law, of which the pivotal sentence has just been quoted, he says with unconscious irony, as the clemency of the rulers began its gentler sway, for a time at least the vehemence of the disturbers seemed to increase. A Daniel come to judgments, adopting the prejudiced opinions of the historian Palfrey, he believes that seldom have enthusiasts been more coarse, more unfriendly, more wild and annoying than the early Friends. His sympathy for the persecuted Puritans is so aroused that, for the moment, the spirit of old John Norton seems to possess him. With a vision of an innocent woman stripped to the waist, hauled from town to town, and flogged as she is dragged along at the cart's tail, with this brutal sight in his mind's eye, he commends the clemency of the rulers, and with implied surprise, notes that under its gentler sway, the vehemence of the disturbers seems to increase. Such wretched twaddle is more than discreditable. It is puerile, and yet it passes for historical criticism. On the 27th of November 1661, in obedience to an order from Charles II, King of England, to whom the Friends had applied for relief, the court ordered that the execution of the laws in force against the Quakers, as such so far as they respect corporal punishment or death, be suspended until this court take further order. But on the 8th of October 1662, their fear of the king being allayed, they reenacted the law of May 1661, with an amendment providing that the whipping be but through 3 towns, and the magistrate shall appoint both the towns and the number of stripes in each town to be given. So that's it for this episode about the treatment of the Quakers when they first appeared on the shores of Massachusetts in 1656. As the story mentions, the persecution of the Quakers at this time is what bequeathed to us our religious liberty, as well as our protection against cruel and unusual punishments and other tyrannical abuses of power. People like Edmund Batter, who took it upon themselves to persecute Quakers, would at most receive a fine, while Quakers would be beaten, flogged, and sometimes killed simply for their religious beliefs. I don't know how much of this history is taught in New England, but growing up in Texas, I always pictured the religious persecution that motivated the Bill of Rights to have taken place in England rather than in New England. The author of this book, Richard Hallowell, seems to be very critical of the Puritans, and he suggested a few times that historians that are sympathetic to the Puritan founders of Massachusetts may have glossed over some of the persecution of the Quakers that took place in the 1600s. One reasonable concern the Puritan colonists may have had about Quakers is that they refused to participate in military service, during a time when Indian attacks were not uncommon. But did the Puritans go too far in their treatment of Quakers? Let us know what you think of this conflict between the Puritans and the Quakers in the comments below. Depending on how popular this video is, there will possibly be a second video about what Richard Hallowell describes as a war between Quakers and Puritans. We will probably also have an upcoming episode that talks more about Margaret Jones, who was not a Quaker, but the woman accused of witchcraft in 1648. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been cast aside as unworthy by history channels on TV and by scholars of the present day who refer to themselves as historians. Here on this channel we keep this worthy history alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our mission of keeping actual history alive, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. For $5, you will have access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.